David Kensington was laughing, a deep, resonant sound that echoed off the pristine, floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office. He was leaning over his massive mahogany desk, casually holding a cup of artisan coffee, his eyes locked with Jessica, his new, impossibly vibrant 26-year-old secretary. She was giggling at a joke he'd just made, playfully twirling a strand of golden blonde hair around her manicured finger. At 42, David felt 25 again, invincible, powerful, and sitting at the absolute pinnacle of his career. Then, the heavy oak door clicked open. It wasn't a client. It was a courier, holding a thick, rigid manila envelope sealed with red tape. In 5 seconds, the laughter would die. In 10, his entire, carefully constructed world would legally and violently collapse. David Kensington was a man who believed he had outgrown his own life. As a senior partner at Kensington & Barnes, a premier architectural firm in downtown Chicago, he was the face of modern corporate success. He wore tailored Italian suits, drove a silver Audi A8, and commanded rooms with an easy, practiced charisma. But the truth, one he buried deep down, was that his life was a meticulously curated exhibition. And lately, the most exciting exhibit was Jessica Hayes. Jessica had been hired 3 months ago. She was sharp, energetic, and looked at David not as a middle-aged man tethered to a mortgage and a marriage, but as a titan of industry. When she brought him his morning espresso, her hand would brush against his, just a fraction of a second longer than necessary. When she organized his schedule, she left little sticky notes with smiley faces and inside jokes about his boring clients. She wore Joe Malone perfume, English pear and freesia, a scent that lingered in his office long after she walked out, intoxicating and entirely unlike the subtle, practical soap his wife used. His wife, Sarah. Thinking of Sarah these days felt like looking at a black and white photograph in a room full of high-definition screens. They had met 15 years ago at a dive bar near the University of Michigan. Back then, David was a struggling architecture student pulling all-nighters, and Sarah was a brilliant, quiet accounting major who helped him organize his chaotic life. She was the one who budgeted their meager incomes, who proofread his proposals, and who convinced a small local bank to give him the business loan that launched his firm. But over the years, as David's star rose, Sarah had faded into the background. She quit her corporate job at Deloitte to manage their household and their real estate investments. She traded pencil skirts for comfortable sweaters. She stopped wanting to go to the flashy gala dinners, preferring to stay in their suburban home with a glass of Pinot Noir and a historical biography. David mistook her quiet contentment for stagnation. He looked at her and saw a woman who had peaked, while he felt he was only just taking flight. The morning of the day his life ended began like any other Tuesday. David had adjusted his tie in the mirror, running a hand through his thick, graying hair. He walked into the kitchen, where Sarah was sitting at the island, sipping black coffee and typing away on her laptop. She didn't look up. "I have a late dinner tonight with the developers for the West Side project," David had said, grabbing a travel mug. It was a lie. He was taking Jessica to a new, exclusive oyster bar downtown to celebrate her 3-month anniversary at the firm. "All right," Sarah replied, her voice perfectly level. She finally looked up, her dark eyes entirely unreadable. "Have a good day, David." There was no kiss goodbye. There hadn't been for months. David felt a brief, fleeting pang of guilt, but it was quickly swallowed by the anticipation of seeing Jessica. He convinced himself that Sarah didn't care anyway. They were roommates, co-managers of a shared existence. When David arrived at the office, Jessica was waiting. She was wearing a tailored navy dress that hugged her perfectly, holding a fresh coffee. "Morning, boss," she chimed, her smile bright enough to light up the corridor. "You have the Harrison review at 10, but I cleared your afternoon. I figured you'd want to leave early for our dinner." She lowered her voice on the last word, giving him a conspiratorial wink. David felt a thrill shoot through his chest. "You're a lifesaver, Jess. What would I do without you?" "Crash and burn, probably," she teased, following him into his office. For the next 2 hours, David floated. He breezed through the Harrison review, his confidence at an all-time high. He returned to his office, loosened his tie, and called Jessica in to go over some paperwork. She stood close to him behind the desk, pointing at a blueprint, her shoulder pressed against his. David turned his head, his face inches from hers. He could smell the freesia. He could see the slight parting of her lips. The air in the room grew thick, charged with an electricity he hadn't felt in a decade. He was just about to close the distance, just about to risk everything right there in the corner office. Then, the heavy oak door clicked open. The man standing in the doorway was entirely out of place in the sleek, minimalist aesthetic of Kensington and Barnes. He wore a rumpled grey suit and a baseball cap, looking bored and mildly annoyed. David immediately stepped back from Jessica, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He cleared his throat, suddenly overly aware of how close they had been standing. "Excuse me, this is a private office. How did you get past reception?" The man didn't answer the question. He simply walked forward, his heavy boots thudding against the hardwood floor, and dropped a thick, rigid manila envelope onto the center of David's mahogany desk. "David Kensington?" the man asked, his voice a dull monotone. "Yes." "Who are you?" David demanded, trying to project authority to cover his lingering panic. "Consider yourself served." The man turned on his heel and walked out, letting the glass door swing shut behind him. The silence that followed was deafening. Jessica let out a nervous little laugh. "What was that? A prank?" David stared at the envelope. It sat there like an unexploded bomb. The return address was a law firm, not just any law firm. Wright, Sterling, and Hayes, the most aggressive, ruthless family law practice in Chicago. The senior partner, Thomas Wright, was a guy David played golf with twice a year. David's hands actually trembled as he picked up a silver letter opener. He sliced through the thick tape and pulled out a massive stack of legal documents. The bold, black letters on the first page seemed to swim in his vision before locking into a horrifying clarity. In the Circuit Court of Cook County, Illinois petition for dissolution of marriage. Sarah Jean Kensington, petitioner versus David James Kensington. Respondent, David? Jessica asked softly, sensing the sudden shift in the room's atmosphere. "Are you okay? You look like you just saw a ghost." David couldn't speak. He flipped to the second page, then the third. This wasn't a standard, boilerplate divorce filing. This was a forensic dismantling of his entire life. It detailed assets David didn't even know Sarah was fully aware of. It listed his secret offshore brokerage account in the Caymans, the one he had opened 3 years ago and funded with diverted bonuses. How the hell did she know about that? He flipped frantically to the section on property division. His eyes widened in absolute horror. Sarah wasn't just asking for half the house in the suburbs. The documents revealed a structural reality about his own business that David had blindly ignored for a decade. When they had incorporated Kensington and Barnes, David had been drowning in debt. To protect the firm from potential liability, Sarah had set up a separate holding company, SJK Holdings, to purchase the commercial real estate that housed the firm's office. David had always treated it as a technicality, paying rent to their shared holding company. But looking at the paperwork in his trembling hands, the legal truth hit him like a physical blow. Sarah was the sole managing member of SJK Holdings. She owned the building. She owned the literal ground he was standing on. And attached to the divorce petition was a formal 30-day notice of eviction for Kensington and Barnes. "David, talk to me," Jessica said, her voice tightening with genuine concern. She reached out and touched his arm. David recoiled as if she had burned him. "Don't," he snapped, his voice harsh and foreign to his own ears. He grabbed his cell phone from the desk and dialed Sarah's number. It rang once, then went straight to voicemail. "You've reached Sarah. Leave a message." "Sarah, what the hell is this?" he hissed into the phone, turning away from Jessica. "Call me back immediately. We need to talk. You can't just do this out of nowhere." He hung up, breathing heavily, his mind racing. Out of nowhere. The phrase echoed in his head, mocking him. Was it out of nowhere? He looked back down at the sprawling pile of paper. Toward the back, there was an exhibit section. Exhibit A. David flipped to it, expecting bank statements or property deeds. Instead, he found printed screenshots, dozens of them. They were text messages. His text messages. David, 10:14 p.m. "I can't stop thinking about you in that blue dress today." Jessica, 10:16 p.m. "You shouldn't be thinking about me at all, Mr. Kensington David." 10:20 p.m. "Hard not to. My wife went to sleep an hour ago. It's just me and a glass of scotch wishing you were here." David felt the blood drain from his face. His stomach bottomed out, a wave of profound nausea washing over him. He looked up at Jessica, who was trying to crane her neck to see what he was reading. Sarah hadn't just been sitting at home baking bread and reading biographies. While David thought she was fading into the background, she had been quietly, methodically observing. She had accessed his phone backups from their shared iCloud account, an account she had set up for him years ago because he was too busy to deal with the tech. She knew everything. She had known for weeks, maybe months. Every time he had lied about a late meeting, every time he had smiled at his phone under the dinner table, she had been sitting there, perfectly calm, gathering ammunition. "Is it bad news?" Jessica asked, her wide blue eyes looking up at him. David looked at her. Really looked at her. Suddenly, the youthful energy he had found so intoxicating seemed incredibly shallow. The freesia perfume smelled sickly sweet, almost suffocating in the sterile air of the office. He had risked a 15-year marriage, a multi-million-dollar firm, and his entire reputation for a cliched office romance. "Get out," David whispered, his voice cracking. Jessica blinked, taken aback. "What? David, what's wrong?" "I said get out!" he roared, slamming his fist down on the mahogany desk so hard his coffee mug rattled. "Get out of my office, Jessica! Now!" She jumped, her face flushing with shock and indignation. She grabbed her phone and practically ran out of the office, slamming the glass door behind her. David was left alone in the sudden, crushing silence. He sank into his expensive leather chair, the divorce papers scattered across his desk like the wreckage of a plane crash. He looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the Chicago skyline, the city he thought he had conquered. His phone buzzed on the desk. He lunged for it, desperate for it to be Sarah. It was a text message, but not from his wife. It was from Thomas Wright, his lawyer buddy, now representing the woman who was currently dismantling his life. "Thomas, David, I assume you've been served. Do not try to contact Sarah again. Any communication goes through my office. We will see you in court. P.S. Check your business accounts." A fresh spike of ice shot through David's veins. "Check your business accounts." His hands shaking uncontrollably, David logged into his firm's secure banking portal. The screen loaded, displaying the operating accounts for Kensington and Barnes. The balance of the primary payroll and operations account, which yesterday had held over $600,000, now displayed a number that made David stop breathing entirely. $0. David's vision tunneled. The glowing zeros on his computer screen burned themselves into his retinas. $600,000, the lifeblood of Kensington and Barnes, the payroll for 42 employees, the retainer fees for 3 major downtown projects, was gone, evaporated. His hand, slick with cold sweat, fumbled for his desk phone. He dialed the direct line for William Abernathy, the senior commercial branch manager at First Heritage Bank. The phone rang 4 times before William answered, his tone uncharacteristically formal. "Abernathy speaking." "William, it's David Kensington," David barked, trying to keep the panic from fracturing his voice. "I'm looking at the operating account for the firm. There's been a massive banking error. The balance is at 0. I need you to reverse whatever glitch just happened immediately." There was a heavy, agonizing pause on the other end of the line. "David," William said softly, the sound of a man delivering a terminal diagnosis. "It's not a glitch. The funds were legally transferred out at 9 a.m. this morning." "Transferred? By who?" David shouted, rising from his leather chair. "I'm the managing partner. Nobody authorizes a transfer of that size without my explicit, dual-factor authentication." "Sarah did," William replied flatly. "And she had every legal right to do so." David felt the floor drop out from beneath him. "That's impossible. Sarah hasn't touched the firm's books in 7 years." "She may not have touched them, David, but you never removed her as the primary corporate guarantor and chief financial officer on the master operating agreement. When you two founded the firm, she was the one who structured the accounts. Furthermore," William sighed, rustling papers, "she didn't just initiate a standard wire transfer. She walked in here with a court-certified ex parte emergency freezing order, signed by Judge Harmon in the Cook County Family Division." "An emergency order? On what grounds?" "On the grounds of flight risk of capital," William explained, his voice turning cold. "She provided the court with documented proof of a heavily funded, undeclared offshore account in the Cayman Islands. The judge authorized the immediate sweeping of all domestic business assets into a court-monitored escrow account to prevent you from hiding marital funds. My hands are tied, David. You need to call your lawyer." The line went dead. David slowly lowered the receiver, the dial tone buzzing in the silent office. He didn't just lose his marriage today. He had lost his company. The oak door to his office swung open without a knock. It wasn't Jessica this time. It was Arthur Barnes. Arthur was 64, a titan of old-money Chicago architecture, and the man whose name brought prestige to David's aggressive modern designs. Arthur was notoriously principled, a man who still drafted blueprints by hand and despised corporate scandal. Right now, Arthur looked like he was ready to commit murder. "Arthur," David stammered, his mind scrambling for a plausible lie. "I'm dealing with a slight banking issue." "Save it," Arthur growled, stepping into the room and slamming the door behind him. He threw a printed email onto David's desk. "I just got off the phone with our payroll provider. They ran the bi-weekly deposits and they all bounced, every single one. And then I got a courtesy call from Thomas Wright. Do you know Thomas Wright, David?" David swallowed hard. "He's Sarah's attorney." "He's a shark," Arthur corrected, leaning over the desk, his face inches from David's. "And he informed me, purely as a professional courtesy to me, that my junior partner is not only getting taken to the cleaners in a divorce, but has also been funneling company bonuses into an offshore tax haven, thereby triggering a complete asset freeze on our entire firm." "Arthur, I can explain. The offshore account was just a separate investment vehicle." "Do not insult my intelligence," Arthur roared, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. We have a $60 million commercial development breaking ground in the West Loop on Monday. We have 40 employees expecting paychecks on Friday. And because you couldn't keep your pants zipped around the 26-year-old receptionist— Secretary, David corrected automatically, immediately realizing how incredibly stupid it sounded. Arthur stared at him, a look of profound, chilling disgust washing over his features. You are pathetic. Thomas Wright also sent over a copy of the eviction notice. Your wife owns the building, David. She is evicting Kensington and Barnes. We'll fight it. She can't just throw out a commercial tenant. I am not fighting your wife, David, Arthur interrupted, his voice dropping to a lethal calm. Sarah is a brilliant woman. If she pulled this trigger, she made damn sure the gun was loaded. I am calling an emergency meeting of the board. I am initiating the moral turpitude clause in our partnership agreement to sever you from this firm immediately. You have until 5 p.m. to pack your personal belongings. Do not speak to any of the staff. Arthur turned and walked out, leaving the door wide open. David slumped back into his chair, utterly defeated. Through the open door, he could see the bullpen of the office. Word was already spreading. Whispers hissed over the low cubicle walls. He looked toward the reception area. Jessica was standing by the water cooler, furiously texting on her phone. She looked up, caught his eye, and her expression was completely blank. There was no affection, no playful spark, only the cold calculation of a young woman realizing she was standing on a sinking ship. She didn't come in to check on him. She simply turned her back and walked away. The illusion of the powerful, untouchable David Kensington was entirely dead. Now came the reality. 2 hours later, David sat in a suffocatingly small conference room in the offices of Cole and Associates. Harrison Cole was arguably the most vicious defense and divorce attorney in the state of Illinois. If Thomas Wright was a shark, Harrison Cole was a megalodon. He was a man who thrived on destroying his opponents. But as Harrison flipped through the towering stack of divorce documents, his characteristic smirk began to fade. The only sound in the room was the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock and the rustle of heavy legal paper. Well, David finally asked, his knee bouncing anxiously under the glass table. Tell me we can crush this. Tell me we can file an injunction against the eviction and unfreeze the accounts. Harrison took off his tortoise-shell reading glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. He looked at David not with pity, but with a clinical sort of exasperation. David, how long was Sarah an accountant at Deloitte? Harrison asked quietly. I don't know. 5 years before she quit to manage the house? Why does that matter? Because, Harrison sighed, tapping a thick manicured finger on a specific, brightly flagged document in the middle of the pile. You forgot that you married an apex predator of forensic accounting. You didn't just cheat on a housewife, David. You cheated on a woman who understands the U.S. tax code better than I do. What are you talking about? Harrison spun the document around and slid it across the table. It wasn't a divorce decree. It was an official government form, emblazoned with the terrifying seal of the Department of the Treasury. IRS Form 211, Application for Award for Original Information. What is this? David asked, his voice barely a whisper. It's a whistleblower form, Harrison stated bluntly. Sarah didn't just use your Cayman Islands account as leverage in family court. She reported you to the Internal Revenue Service for willful tax evasion. The blood rushed out of David's head, so fast he felt momentarily dizzy. She called the IRS on me. Oh, she did much more than call them, Harrison said, flipping to the attached exhibits. She provided them with a fully documented, indexed, and cross-referenced binder of your offshore wire transfers. She proved that you had been undervaluing your firm's revenue, taking your year-end distributions as cash and routing them through a shell corporation in Delaware before parking them in the Caymans. I only did it for 3 years, David pleaded, grasping at straws. It's maybe $1 million. 2 at most. The amount doesn't matter, David. The intent does, Harrison snapped. Do you know what happens when a spouse reports you via Form 211? David shook his head, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. The IRS freezes the offshore assets pending a federal investigation, Harrison explained, ticking the points off on his fingers. Which gives Sarah the perfect excuse to tell a family court judge that you are actively hiding marital assets, allowing her to legally freeze your domestic accounts to preserve the marital estate. Harrison leaned forward, his eyes locked on David's. But here is the true stroke of genius. Here is the part that proves your wife has been planning this for a very long time. Under the IRS whistleblower program, if the agency collects taxes, penalties, and interest based on the information provided, the whistleblower is legally entitled to between 15 and 30% of the total recovered amount. David stared at his lawyer, his jaw slightly open. You're saying, I'm saying, Harrison concluded grimly, that Sarah is not only going to send the federal government after you to seize your hidden money, but the government is going to take that money, legally wash it, and hand her 30% of it as a reward. A reward, I might add, that is entirely exempt from marital asset division because it is a federal bounty awarded directly to her. David felt physically ill. He grabbed the nearest trash can, half expecting to vomit, but only let out a dry, ragged cough. She weaponized the federal government against me, David muttered, staring blankly at the beige carpet. She built a guillotine, David, and she let you stick your own head in it, Harrison corrected. The divorce? The infidelity? The text messages with your secretary? That's just the theater. It's the emotional smoke screen. While you were worried about hiding your affair, she was methodically stripping away your financial and professional infrastructure. What do we do, Harrison? David begged. How do I fight this? Harrison leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers. He looked at David for a long, quiet moment. Right now, you don't fight her in family court. You can't. She has you dead to rights on the infidelity, which nullifies the standard alimony caps in your prenup. She owns your building. She has frozen your capital. Your firm is going to oust you by dinner time. Harrison stood up and walked over to the window, looking out over the city. Your immediate problem isn't Sarah, David. Your immediate problem is the Criminal Investigation Division of the IRS. If they decide to pursue this as criminal tax evasion rather than a civil penalty, you aren't just looking at losing your house and your firm. Harrison turned back to face him, his expression stone cold. You are looking at 3 to 5 years in federal prison. David Kensington, the man who had woken up that morning feeling invincible, buried his face in his trembling hands and began to weep. 10 miles away from the crumbling empire of Kensington and Barnes, Sarah Kensington sat in the quiet sunroom of their 4-bedroom colonial in Evanston. She wasn't baking, and she wasn't reading a historical biography. She was watching the blinking cursor on her secure banking dashboard. At precisely 9:02 a.m., the numbers had shifted. The transfer from the firm's operating accounts into the court-mandated escrow had cleared. Sarah exhaled, a long, shaky breath that she felt she had been holding for 6 months. She closed the laptop, walked into the kitchen, and poured the rest of her morning coffee down the sink. There was no joy in what she had just done. There was no cinematic triumph. There was only the cold, sterile satisfaction of a balanced ledger. For 15 years, Sarah had been the invisible scaffolding that held David's life together. When he was a terrified architecture student failing structural engineering, she was the one who drilled him on the formulas until 3 a.m. When he wanted to start his own firm but had the credit score of a ghost, she used her own meticulous savings and her pristine financial history to secure the loans. She formed SJK Holdings to buy the commercial real estate because David, in his arrogant optimism, refused to consider the liability of a potential bankruptcy. "Always protect the foundation, David," she used to tell him. He had laughed, kissed her forehead, and called her his worrywart. The foundation began to crack exactly 182 days ago. It was a Sunday. David was playing a round of golf with Thomas Wright and some other partners. Sarah had been cleaning out the home office when David's old iPad, synced to his primary iCloud account, chimed. It was an email receipt from a boutique florist downtown, $300 for a custom arrangement of English pears and freesias delivered to a Jessica Hayes at the firm's address. The attached note read, "To celebrate my favorite distraction." D. Sarah hadn't screamed. She hadn't thrown a plate against the wall. She was a forensic accountant. Her brain was wired to process trauma as data. She sat down in his leather chair, opened a blank Excel spreadsheet, and named the file Reconciliation. Over the next 3 weeks, while David thought she was sleeping beside him, Sarah was methodically auditing his digital and financial life. The iCloud backups gave her the text messages, the nauseating, cliched exchanges of a middle-aged man desperate to feel young. But it was the financial audit that truly broke her heart, transforming her profound grief into a terrifying, icy rage. She tracked the discrepancies in his income. David had always been loose with money, but Sarah noticed that his reported year-end partner distributions didn't match the firm's gross revenue projections. She dug into the K-1 tax forms. She cross-referenced the corporate tax filings with their personal joint returns. Then she found the wire transfers. Small at first, routed through a shell LLC in Delaware, eventually funneling into a numbered account at a private bank in the Cayman Islands. He wasn't just cheating on her with a 26-year-old secretary. He was stealing from their marital estate. He was stealing the security she had sacrificed her own career to build. That was the day the wife died, and the auditor took over. She didn't confront him. A confrontation would give him time to hide the money, time to spin a web of lies, time to make her look like the crazy, jealous spouse. Instead, she called Thomas Wright. Thomas had been David's golfing buddy, but Thomas was a shark who respected power and preparation. When Sarah walked into his office, bypassed the small talk, and slid a 3-inch binder of legally admissible evidence across his desk, including the completed IRS Form 211 whistleblower application, Thomas had actually smiled. "Sarah," Thomas had said, tapping the binder. "I always told David he married out of his league. What do you want?" "I want the building. I want the house. I want the marital assets completely isolated from his impending federal tax liability," she replied, her voice dead flat. "And I want him to understand exactly what happens when you remove the foundation from a glass house." Now, sitting in the quiet kitchen, Sarah looked at her phone. She had one missed call from David and a frantic, breathless voicemail demanding to know what she was doing. She didn't listen to it all the way through. She simply deleted it, blocked his number, and began packing a small suitcase. She was spending the next month at a quiet cabin in Aspen. Her work here was done. The gravity of his own actions would do the rest. The rain in Chicago that late afternoon wasn't a dramatic, cinematic downpour. It was a cold, miserable, relentless drizzle that seemed to seep directly into David's bones as he stood paralyzed on the sidewalk outside the towering glass facade of Cole and Associates. He didn't have an umbrella. He hadn't needed one in years. A man of his stature usually parked his silver Audi A8 in the climate-controlled, secure underground garage of his own commercial building, taking a private elevator directly to the penthouse suite. But he didn't have a building anymore. The memory of what had transpired just hours earlier played on a sickening, continuous loop in his mind. At precisely 4:45 p.m., a burly private security guard named Mike, a man David had personally approved for hire 2 years ago to keep out aggressive solicitors, had awkwardly, silently escorted him out of the bustling bullpen of Kensington and Barnes. The humiliation had been absolute. David had been forced to carry a single, flimsy cardboard banker's box containing the pathetic remnants of his 20-year career. A silver-framed photograph of a suspension bridge he had designed in his 30s, 2 engraved Mont Blanc fountain pens, a spare silk Brioni tie, and a half-empty bottle of scotch. He had walked past the open cubicles of his junior architects, feeling the weight of 4 dozen pairs of eyes burning into his back. No one had spoken. The silence of the firm he had built had been the loudest sound he had ever heard. Shivering in the damp chill, David unlocked his Audi, his hand still trembling violently from the brutal reality check delivered by Harrison Cole. The threat of a federal criminal indictment hung over his head like a physical, suffocating weight, crushing the breath out of his lungs. He climbed into the driver's seat, the buttery, hand-stitched leather cold and unforgiving against his damp suit. He desperately needed a drink. He needed a warm bed. Most of all, he needed someone to look him in the eye and tell him this was all just a catastrophic, reversible nightmare. He pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over the screen. He bypassed his contacts and opened his direct messages with Jessica. David, 5:10 p.m. Jess, I need to see you. Please, everything is falling apart faster than I can process. Sarah went insane. I've been locked out of the firm. Can I come to your place tonight? I just need you. He watched the little blue delivery notification pop up beneath the text. Delivered. He gripped the steering wheel, waiting. 3 minutes passed, then 5, then 10 excruciating minutes of absolute silence. Finally, the 3 little grey typing dots appeared on the bottom left of the screen. David leaned forward, a pathetic, desperate surge of hope rising in his tight chest. At least he had her. At least the magnetic, electric connection they shared was real. He had blown up his life, yes, but he had done it for passion. The long text block came through, bursting his delusion instantly. Jessica, 5:21 p.m. David, please don't contact me again. I just got out of a very intense 2-hour meeting with Arthur Barnes and the head of HR. I am keeping my job, but they made it a strict condition of my continued employment that I sever all personal and professional ties with you immediately. They told us about the SEC filings and the IRS whistleblower stuff. I'm sorry, but I am 26. I cannot and will not be dragged into a federal tax evasion investigation. Please lose my number. Good luck. A beat later, before David could even type a single letter in response, another automated notification popped up in the chat window. Read receipts have been disabled. She had blocked him. Just like that. The intoxicating office romance, the lingering touches by the espresso machine, the whispered promises of romantic weekend getaways to the vineyards in Napa Valley. It all evaporated, the exact second his bank account hit 0 and his elite status was revoked. She didn't love David Kensington. She loved the senior partner of Kensington and Barnes. Without the title, the power, and the money, he was just a terrified, middle-aged man sitting in a damp car, completely radioactive. God, David choked out, slamming his palms aggressively against the steering wheel, the horn blaring briefly in the empty parking structure. God damn it! He threw the car into drive and merged blindly into the sluggish, miserable downtown traffic. He couldn't go home to their sprawling colonial in Evanston. Thomas Wright's legal notice had made it explicitly, terrifyingly clear. Sarah had filed for and received exclusive occupancy of the marital residence pending the divorce proceedings. This was backed by an emergency temporary restraining order, signed by a judge to prevent David from tampering with or destroying physical financial records at the house. If he pulled into his own driveway, Sarah would call the police, and he would be arrested for violating a court order. He navigated toward the Magnificent Mile, pulling up to the valet stand at the Peninsula Hotel. He would check into a luxury suite, order a $200 bottle of Macallan room service, and figure out how to survive the week. He needed to feel like himself again. He strode into the opulent, chandelier-lit lobby, trying to project his usual aura of casual, untouchable wealth, though his grey suit was visibly damp and his eyes were heavily bloodshot. He approached the polished marble front desk and handed his sleek, heavy metal platinum American Express card to an impeccably dressed concierge. "I need a standard king suite for the next 3 nights, please," David said, forcing a tight, authoritative smile. The concierge ran the heavy metal card through the terminal. A subtle, polite frown creased his forehead. He tapped the screen and ran it a second time. "I am terribly sorry, Mr. Kensington," the concierge said, his voice dropping to a discreet, intensely apologetic whisper meant to save face. "The terminal is declining the transaction. The merchant code reads, account frozen. Contact primary account issuer." David felt a hot, prickling flush of profound humiliation creep up his neck. A well-dressed couple standing directly behind him in the lobby shifted impatiently, murmuring to each other. "There must be a fraud alert. I travel frequently." David lied smoothly, his heart hammering against his ribs. He pulled out his wallet and retrieved his backup card, a premium visa tied to the primary joint checking account he shared with Sarah. "Run this one." The concierge swiped it. The machine beeped instantly. He didn't even try a second time. He looked up at David with a mixture of pity and professional detachment. "Declined as well, sir. The system is showing a hard freeze on this line of credit. Do you have another alternative form of payment? Cash, perhaps?" Sarah hadn't just drained the business operating accounts. She had ruthlessly initiated a hard freeze on all shared credit lines, mortgages, and joint accounts to prevent the unlawful dissipation of the marital estate, exactly as Harrison Cole had warned him she would. She had financially suffocated him in a matter of hours, trapping him in an invisible, legal cage. "Never mind," David whispered, his voice cracking. He snatched the useless plastic and metal cards back from the marble counter. He turned and walked out of the luxurious, warm lobby, the scent of expensive lilies giving way to the biting, exhaust-choked Chicago wind. Standing under the hotel awning, he opened his leather wallet. He had exactly $42 and a few crumpled receipts to his name. An hour later, the elegant silver Audi A8 was parked tightly between a rusted pickup truck and a dented sedan in the dimly lit, potholed lot of a rundown Motel 6 on the industrial outskirts of O'Hare Airport. David had paid his $40 in cash to a bored clerk behind a pane of bulletproof glass. He sat on the very edge of a sagging, floral-patterned mattress that smelled faintly of stale cigarette smoke, industrial bleach, and despair. He stared blankly at the flickering, buzzing red neon vacancy sign outside his single, barred window. Every 3 minutes, the deafening roar of a commercial jet taking off rattled the cheap glass in its frame. The silence of the cheap motel room in between the jet engines was absolute. There were no giggling secretaries fetching him artisan coffee. There were no sycophantic junior architects praising his structural designs. There was no Sarah quietly, expertly managing the sprawling chaos of his daily life so he could fly free. Unable to sit still in the suffocating room, he opened his phone, bypassing his empty message inbox, and clicked on his camera roll. He scrolled rapidly past the hundreds of recent pictures, the glamorous building sites, the expensive dinners, the selfies with Jessica that now made physical bile rise in his throat. He kept scrolling, going back years, desperate for an anchor. He finally stopped on a picture from exactly 10 years ago. It was Sarah. She was sitting at their old, scratched wooden kitchen table in a worn-out, oversized University of Michigan sweatshirt. She was entirely surrounded by towering stacks of complex tax documents, property deeds, and 2 different calculators. She was looking up at the camera, her hair tied in a messy bun, dark circles under her eyes, but smiling with a fierce, quiet pride. It was 2 a.m. on the night she had successfully finalized the labyrinthine commercial loan for SJK Holdings. It was the exact night she had legally bought the building that made his entire architectural dream possible. David stared at the glowing screen, looking at the brilliant, exhausted woman he had completely erased from his own arrogant narrative of success. Sitting in the dingy motel room, he finally, horrifyingly understood the fatal structural flaw in his life's architecture. He had built his entire ego, his entire empire, and his entire identity on a foundation of her intelligence, her credit, and her unwavering loyalty. And because he had treated that foundational pillar like dirt, she had simply, elegantly, and entirely legally pulled it out from under him, letting the entire glass house shatter around his ears. Tomorrow morning, he had to swallow his pride and call a federal criminal defense attorney to arrange his surrender. But tonight, David Kensington laid back on the cheap, scratchy polyester bedspread, pulled his knees tightly to his chest in the dark, and finally allowed himself to shatter. 6 months later, the blistering Chicago summer had baked the city into a suffocating concrete oven, but inside Conference Room B, on the 14th floor of the Everett McKinley Dirksen United States Courthouse, the air conditioning was running at a distinctly freezing temperature. David Kensington sat at a scarred wooden table, his once impeccable posture hunched, his shoulders caved inward like a building whose load-bearing walls had been systematically removed. The custom-tailored Italian suits he used to wear with such effortless arrogance had been liquidated to a high-end consignment shop months ago, a desperate attempt to keep pace with Harrison Cole's staggering legal retainers. Today, David wore a slightly baggy, off-the-rack grey suit from a discount retailer. It felt heavy and abrasive against his skin. He looked a full decade older than he had in February. The distinguished silver at his temples had rapidly overtaken the dark brown entirely, and deep, exhausted, bruised-looking bags hung permanently beneath his hollowed eyes. Across the table sat Special Agent Gregory Higgins of the Internal Revenue Service's Criminal Investigation Division. Higgins was not a man who relied on theatrical intimidation. He didn't yell, he didn't pound his fists on the table, and he didn't glare. He was a terrifyingly calm, meticulously groomed bureaucrat. He was a man armed with a calculator, an encyclopedic knowledge of the federal tax code, and the limitless, crushing weight of the United States government behind him. "Mr. Kensington," Higgins began, his voice devoid of any inflection, as he slid a massive, red-tabbed accordion folder across the table. It landed with a heavy, definitive thud. "My investigative team has officially concluded the forensic audit of the offshore financial vehicles housed at the Cayman National Bank. This exhaustive process, as you are aware, was triggered by the highly detailed Form 211 Whistleblower filing we received earlier this year." David didn't reach for the folder. He just stared at the thick red tabs like they were radioactive, his stomach churning with a familiar, acidic dread. Beside him, Harrison Cole let out a slow, measured sigh, took off his tortoiseshell glasses, and pinched the bridge of his nose. "Let's bypass the preamble and get straight to the final numbers, Agent Higgins," Harrison said, his tone all business. "My client has surrendered his passport, fully cooperated with your investigators, and is prepared to resolve this matter today." "The numbers are quite clear, Mr. Cole," Higgins said, opening the file and flattening a heavily redacted spreadsheet with the palm of his hand. "Over a period of 42 months, your client successfully and willfully diverted $1.8 million in undeclared partner distributions from his architectural firm. He deliberately routed these funds through a domestic shell corporation before moving them offshore." Higgins paused, looking up from the paper to meet David's terrified gaze. "However, Mr. Kensington, you severely underestimated the compounding nature of federal penalties. You failed to account for the aggressive civil fraud assessments, the daily compounding interest on the unpaid principal, and the draconian penalties for failing to file a foreign bank and financial accounts report, or FBAR. The federal government, Mr. Kensington, does not simply want its tax revenue returned. It requires its pound of flesh to deter others." Higgins took a silver pen from his breast pocket and tapped a bolded, double-underlined figure at the absolute bottom of the page. "Your total finalized liability, encompassing back taxes, accumulated interest, and the mandatory 75% civil fraud penalty, comes to $3.9 million. David's breath hitched violently in his throat. The walls of the sterile conference room seemed to warp and close in around him. 3.9? He choked out, his voice cracking. "I didn't even steal $2 million. How is that mathematically possible? Where on earth am I supposed to get $4 million? "That, frankly, is not the concern of the Treasury Department," Higgins replied flatly, his expression unchanging. "We will place a permanent lien on all of your future earnings until the debt is satisfied. However, given your full cooperation, your lack of prior criminal history, and your willingness to sign over all remaining liquidated domestic assets today, the United States Attorney's Office has authorized me to offer a binding plea agreement." Higgins pulled a separate stapled document from the folder and pushed it toward David. "You will plead guilty to one single count of felony tax evasion," Higgins dictated. "You will surrender yourself to the Bureau of Prisons to serve 18 months in a minimum security federal correctional institution. This will be followed by 3 years of closely monitored, supervised release. In exchange, the prosecution will definitively drop the remaining wire fraud charges and will not pursue the 10-year statutory maximum sentence. 18 months in federal prison." David closed his eyes, the brutal reality washing over him like a tidal wave of wet concrete. 6 months ago, he had been standing in a sunlit corner office, sipping artisan espresso, flirting with a beautiful 26-year-old, and genuinely believing he was an untouchable master of the universe. Now, he was a ruined, convicted felon who would be spending the next year and a half sleeping on a thin, metal cot in a federal camp, stripped of his name and reduced to an inmate number. "Sign the paperwork, David," Harrison Cole muttered softly, pressing a cheap plastic ballpoint pen into David's trembling hand. "It's the best deal you're ever going to get. If ego makes you take this to a jury trial, Higgins will ensure they bury you under the jail." With a hand that shook so violently he could barely form the letters, David Kensington signed his name, officially and legally signing away his freedom. When he finally walked out of the Dirksen courthouse, The blinding, oppressive summer sun hit his face like a physical blow. He stood on the bustling Chicago pavement entirely alone. He pulled out a cheap, prepaid burner phone, his only line of communication now. The screen was blank. There were no messages. Jessica Hayes had vanished into the corporate ether months ago. The moment the scandal broke, she had leveraged her connections to secure a transfer to a rival architecture firm in New York City, blocking his number without a second thought. The senior partners at Kensington and Barnes had formally convened a board meeting and voted unanimously to strip his disgraced name from the door. The prestigious firm he had built was now simply known as Barnes and Associates. But the final, most devastating twist of the knife did not come from the unforgiving machinery of the federal government, nor did it come from the cowardly abandonment of his former peers. It arrived 2 weeks later, precisely 48 hours before his scheduled surrender date to the federal prison camp in Marion. David had been sitting on the stained carpet of his depressing, one-bedroom, month-to-month rental in Oak Park. He was methodically packing a small, unbranded canvas duffel bag with the strict list of approved items he was allowed to take into the facility. 6 pairs of plain white socks, 4 white t-shirts, a pair of shower shoes. The profound silence of the dingy apartment was suddenly broken by the sharp scratch of thick paper. An envelope had been slipped under his front door. He stood up, his joints aching with stress, and picked it up. The embossed return address in the corner belonged to the formidable law offices of Thomas Wright. David's stomach plummeted. He tore the heavy paper open, bracing himself for another agonizing legal bill or a finalized asset seizure document designed to take the last few dollars in his checking account. Instead, he pulled out a simple, one-page corporate restructuring notice, printed on the heavy, expensive letterhead of Barnes and Associates. It was a formal memorandum. As a legal courtesy to all former founding stakeholders, Arthur Barnes was officially informing him of the firm's new, finalized ownership structure. The memorandum bluntly explained that because David's offshore scandal had triggered a catastrophic freeze on the firm's operating capital, Arthur had been forced to seek an emergency, massive cash infusion from a silent partner just to keep their flagship commercial projects afloat and avoid total bankruptcy. David's eyes scanned down to the second paragraph, reading the name of the new, controlling majority shareholder. The air violently rushed out of his lungs, and his knees physically gave out. He slumped hard against the cheap, peeling drywall of the apartment, a hollow, broken, slightly hysterical laugh escaping his cracked lips. Sarah Jean Kensington. She hadn't just used the meticulously planned divorce filing to take his beautiful suburban house. She hadn't just used her forensic accounting skills and the IRS to freeze his assets, destroy his career, and secure a massive, multi-$100,000 whistleblower bounty from the federal government. She had executed a flawless, merciless endgame. Sarah had taken that very same government bounty, the mountain of cash she had legally earned as a reward for turning him in, and used it to quietly, legally purchase David's forfeited corporate shares from a desperate Arthur Barnes at a rock-bottom, distressed asset discount. Sarah now owned the physical commercial building the firm operated in, and she now held the controlling, majority interest in the firm itself. She had literally, legally bought the empire he had built, using the very money the government had seized from him as a penalty for his own arrogance. She was the supreme boss, and David was just a broke, soon-to-be inmate, packing cheap white socks into a bag. He had spent years looking at her like she was a faded, irrelevant photograph. He had patronized her, believing she was just a quiet accountant who had peaked in her 20s while he soared to greatness. He had never once realized that while he was busy admiring the flashy, glass facade of his own life, Sarah had been the true, structural architect all along. And when she finally decided he was no longer worth her investment, she had masterfully, ruthlessly, and perfectly engineered his total demolition. David Kensington's spectacular downfall is a brutal masterclass in the destructive power of arrogance and the quiet, devastating precision of a scorned woman holding the receipts. He traded a fiercely loyal partner and a 15-year foundation for the fleeting, cliched thrill of an office romance, entirely blind to the financial and legal realities of his own existence. Sarah did not seek a screaming match or a theatrical confrontation. She sought total, mathematical annihilation. By leveraging his own vanity and financial crimes against him, she legally weaponized the federal government, completely dismantling his wealth, his reputation, and his freedom in a matter of hours. In the end, David didn't just lose his young secretary, his firm, and his marriage. He lost his freedom, outsmarted by the very woman he had arrogantly underestimated. Betrayal is a heavy debt, and the ledger always, inevitably, balances itself out.